Does it do? Okay. So, hello from me. My name is George Kalbourgis, and I am the founder of Infinitivity Design Labs, which is an indie game design and consulting services studio based in France. So, let me give you some information about myself. Okay. So, during the past 10 years, I had the luxury to explore the gaming industry through a variety of roles. I have been a developer, I have been a designer, I have been a user experience researcher, and I have also been a teacher. And for the last 7 years, I have been working a lot with educational gaming, which seems very interesting. And also, recently, I wrote a book, which is called Educational Game Design Fundamentals, a journey to creating intrinsically motivating learning experiences. It's about educational game design. So let's begin. As it has been mentioned already through previous sessions during the conference, we are experiencing a great revolution in technology. So technology becomes part of our lives, and there are several people, entrepreneurs, designers, developers, teachers, educators, that are trying to integrate these technological evolutions in our daily lives. And the gaming industry is no exception to this revolution. So we, as players, as designers, we have experienced this evolution in PCs, in consoles, in mobile, virtual, augmented reality, and this history is still being written. And at the same time, we see that players, the way that people actually learn, players learn, has also evolved. There has been a great discussion during the past decades about integrating games into how people learn. So from one side, we have those people that are very passionate about integrating game design and the games into learning context, because they feel that games have an intrinsically motivating value for people that are actually learning. From the other side, there are those that are skeptical, because they say that games superficially address the topics that they promise to teach players about. And also, they may act as distractors. And we have seen during the past decade several initiatives from the industry, from academia, from public organizations, and from private institutions about creating games about learning. Some of them had a tremendous impact on how players learn. They had a tremendous impact on us, and some of them were extremely boring, and that we try to forget, and some of them we have already forgotten. So there are several reasons why educational games may be efficient. However, the main reason is that educational game design teams consist of members, usually, that do not share the same vision about the games that they want to design. So there are several occasions where these teams may have contradictory visions about what they want to design, and there are several occasions where even the term game is not defined the same way for everybody in the team. So from one side, we have game designers who try to address gaming in the traditional way that we address through casual game design. And there are also educators who try to focus on learning objective and pedagogic approaches. And of course, both of these aspects are of equal importance. We want to create games that have a learning value, but also they are fun to play. So games that fail to integrate, to facilitate learning objectives are actually superficial to help us learn what they promise to help, towards the way that they promise us to learn. And on the other side, games that do not focus on their game mechanics, they are boring, or they are disguised learning activities that are not actually games. And players, students, are extremely capable at spotting those games, and they don't want to play them. So, okay, let's take a step backward and let me tell you a story. I have been working with kids, so we are designing games with kids for kids, usually for educational purposes. And last year I was working with a kindergarten classroom in Greece, working on the topic of mathematical patterning. So just to give you some context, mathematical patterning at this age is not clear to kindergarten students. So the mechanics behind how actually mathematical patterns, for example, triangle, square, and goes on work, are not clear to kindergarten students. And we tried to create games, and through the process of designing games, we expected that players would actually understand how mathematical patterns work. So this is a paper prototype created by 2 kindergarten students of this classroom. So just to explain to you very quickly how the game works, this is a puzzle platform game where we have burger cutlets that need to pass from one side of the screen to the other. So we see that there are some colored burger buns. These are colored burger buns for those who are hungry. This is the continuation of lunch. So, and they try to jump from one side of the screen to the other. If they fall on these brown frying pans that we see on one side of the screen, they will be fried. So by tapping, players can change these frying pans into colored buns. So if they manage to correctly transform the frying pans to the correct color that completes the pattern that we see on the top of the screen, then the cutlets would actually manage to pass to the other side of the screen, else they will fall down and be fried. So the reason why I'm showing you this is that I was in front of the conception of the game theme. And I was amazed when actually the 2 students decided to pick up the theme because one other classmate of theirs, his name was Yannis, liked hamburgers. So this was user-centered design on its core. And it was actually done by 2 kindergarten students. And I realized that we, in adult educational game design teams, sometimes we forget about the user because we spend a lot of time discussing about several other aspects and because there is disagreement inside the team. And part of my research is related to how we can improve the educational game design process. So as part of a broader research, we conducted several interviews with educators of all sorts, university professors, the teachers, trainers, game designers, and game developers that were all members previously of educational game design teams. And we came up with the following journey map. So I will very briefly go through the map. So initially there is a team, the team is assembled. Later on, the team comes up with a topic. Everybody tries to contribute to the theme of the game. Later on, there is design, development, evaluation, and if there is the possibility, there is also a reiteration. What actually everybody described is either a linear or an iterative process. And this is not very much different from what we have in other types of games. Let's, however, have a look on how different stakeholders feel during these steps. So here we have game designers and educators. At the beginning of the design process, everybody is actually invigorated that they are going to participate in the creation of a new game. And as the process goes on and the topic is decided, everybody wants to contribute to the project and to present their opinion and their view of the topic by explaining how game design works or how the learning objectives and the pedagogic approach that they want to implement actually work. However, when design and development start, we see misalignment. From one side, game designers feel that they are held back by the educators, and the educators feel that their opinion is not being taken into account. And this misalignment is actually evident from here on till the end of the game. Eventually, we have games that for game designers are boring and for educators are not usable in their deliveries. So nobody is actually going to use these games. So more or less, what we see is that there may be educational game design teams that are not aligned and they don't share the same vision. And when this happens, there is disagreement, there is friction that when it exists, the future of the game, the future of the project is at stake. And I have personally experienced several occasions where we scrapped the project because the stakeholders and the consortia that were participating in the project could not agree on the nature of the game. However, it has been observed that this friction could potentially be decreased or even eliminated if we were using user experience research tools, such like personas and user journeys. Personas, which is a classic user experience research tool, helps us put a focus on our audience. With personas, we can define a portion of our audience and anticipate their behavior and their reaction when they play our games. However, educational games have some particularities compared to other types of games. And we had to adapt our personas for the needs of the educational games. The main aspect that we needed to take into account was that not everybody learns in the same way. We are actually all different and we learn in different ways. We approach our environment in different ways. We perceive our environment in different ways. We receive, we process, we conquer information in different ways. And when we engage in learning activities, or when we play new educational games, we do not all have the same amount of information in order to complete the game. It's very possible that someone that lives in one country and in another have different curricula, have been taught courses in different ways, or even in different regions in the same country. And they may not possess, they may not have the same starting point. These were aspects that we needed to take into account when we were designing our personas. And also we need to take into account accessibility. In several occasions, there are public institutions that want to create educational games where we need to take into account a large population that which is this audience. So apart from actually defining the age range, the needs, the expectations, the context around of our persona, we also needed to give as much information as possible about how our audience is actually learning. And in this way, we try to explain several aspects related to the mastery of our audience concerning the topic that we wanted to teach. And on top of that, we also wanted to present as much information as possible regarding their approach to learning. For example, we used learning styles. We tried to address the misconceptions that they had so that we would actually make them disappear during the game, or if they were blocking points, we had to address them either before the game or at some point during the progression of our games. And we try to have this information as soon as possible so that everybody is aligned, because these tools actually, one of the main aspects that, one of the main benefits was that would bring everybody on the same table and they would all be aligned on the topic and the problem that they needed to solve. So just to say something before I go to this, I present you this slide, personas are a very powerful tool in educational game design, but also they can be very tricky. So I have here two examples that I would like to show to you. This is a screenshot from a game that we designed called Ladybug's Box Early Childhood Mathematics. So this was a game that was developed for mobile devices and was aiming at helping players develop their spatial thinking skills. In kindergarten, the term left or right are not that clear. But apart from this, spatial thinking is also related to mental transformations, rotations, the way that I see now the space is not in the same way that you are seeing space at the moment. Giving and receiving spatial directions, being able to locate myself on a map, these are all aspects that are yet not clear to children of the early childhood and for several adults as well. So in that regard, we tried to create a game for the kindergarten. When we started developing the game, we realized that there are several European countries that do not define kindergarten in the same way. There are children that go to the kindergarten at the age of 3, at the age of 4, and at the age of 5. So this difference, this difference in this age is tremendous. There is a tremendous cognitive difference, a tremendous difference in the cognitive development of a 3-year-old child compared to a 4-year-old child. So we had to take into account different curricula, see how actually different curricula approach the topic that we wanted to teach. We had to conduct interviews with different students, and we also showed different prototypes to these students in order to come up with some personas. And eventually we came up, in this case, with 3 personas that were related to age, mastery of the topic, and apparently something that we hadn't anticipated at that point, at the development of that game, was the familiarity with mobile devices, which apparently was an issue. So here I'm presenting you 2 of the 3. And we used those personas in order to create different introductory levels. And based on this, we later on created different level progressions in order to facilitate the cognitive development, the learning curve of those different players. On top of this, we created instructions for teachers that would be willing to use these games in their classrooms, and later on, we launched some pilot activities in order to test our games. So what you see here is a game that actually was developed by a company in France called Mascotte. So Mascotte, a couple of years ago, was asked to design an educational game that would help French primary school students develop their reading skills. The game had to be accessible to students with auditory and visual deficiencies. So from the very beginning, we tried to define our audience. The issue was that even if the age range was quite well defined, the issue that we faced was that still it was very broad. So we had several accessibility experts that pointed out several aspects and several characteristics that we needed to take into account for different types of players. And we realized that we had to come up with lots and lots of personas, and initially we went with lots and lots of personas. If you hear how many personas we did, you will not believe me. So, and later on we realized that that didn't make any sense because this game needed to be very customizable and needed to adapt to the individual needs of the players that we needed to target. So what we came up eventually was that we tried to list all the characteristics that we need to take into account, and we tried to cluster them and see if there are common patterns that we could address. Eventually we came up with this game. This game is called Quest Island. It is a 3D adventure game. Where players actually follow the story of fairy tale characters, and they interact with different non-player characters, seeing some quests that they need to complete by also reading material that would actually help them develop their reading skills. And there was also an editor that was created by one of the partners in the consortium that we were working with, which actually helped us customize the game, especially for our audience with visual deficiencies. So it turns out that the more our game needs to adapt to the individual needs of each player, the more personas we need. So the more difficult it becomes to use this tool. User journeys, on the other hand, help us in the same way anticipate and project, reflect on the general experience that our players will have when they play our games. However, we had the same issue that educational games have several particularities that are not addressed, that do not exist in other types of games. So we had to adapt our user journeys for this context. So, and mainly we need to take into account the learning progression of our students, of our players. So this is a template that we created for, in order to design our user journeys. And initially we had to describe our audience through personas like the ones that we saw before. And additionally, we tried to describe our learning context and our learning objectives, our game context and our gaming objectives. And from the very beginning, we tried to draft the learning scenario and the game progression. This was done from the very beginning by all stakeholders, and everybody was trying to draft everything that they could from the very beginning. What happened was that from the very beginning, we realized that there were several issues, and this was a good point because we realized that later on we needed to find some solutions to the problems that were coming up. These were pain points for us. So we applied this methodology in a platform called Tactileo Map. So Tactileo Map is an online platform where teachers are able to create learning scenarios by putting points of interest on a map. And they could also create several activities, quizzes, etc. And later on, students would be able to download these scenarios on their mobile phones or on their smartphones or on their tablets, and go outdoors and play with the scenarios that were created for them. We were asked to design some games for this platform, and we brought together educators, designers, game designers, developers. And we tried to address topics like geography, geology, history, and mathematics. So from the very beginning, we started drafting the learning scenario and the learning progression and the game that we wanted to design. We elaborated also on the game mechanics and on the competencies that would be affected by those game mechanics, also narrative aspects of the games. And in several occasions, there were misalignments. So either the game would not be related to the learning objectives that we wanted to target, or the learning objectives were too heavy for the game to be facilitated. So we either changed the game or the narrative aspects in order to facilitate the learning objectives, or on the other hand, we decided to decrease, in some occasions, the learning objectives so that we would have a seamless learning gaming experience. And as part of this, there were also some new features that were presented, because during this ideation session that we would have when we would have these misalignments, eventually we would also, in some occasions, we would also come with new features. This is a new feature that we came up with, which is a live communication chat tool. So eventually, students could communicate and exchange information about the topic, about the quest that they were playing about, especially if it was the same. And this actually unlocked several possibilities for us, because now we had multiplayer capabilities. So actually we worked later on with teams that would be working collaboratively or competitively, or there would be different students that would be playing individually, but against or with other classmates. Later on, we decided also to add interest curves in our user journeys, which also helped us see how the gaming progression is actually affecting the overall experience. And we realized that we had an interesting evaluation tool that would later help us examine and make our games, evolve our games even more if actually we decided to move forward. This is online, Tactilio Map at the moment. And the last project that I would like to show to you is called Sirius Plus. Sirius Plus is actually related to the concept of a makeover, of a classroom makeover. So what we did was we took a traditional classroom and we transformed it into a gaming space. So actually there would be a huge gaming space with 5 play areas. Each area would have a different game, and all the different areas would be around the same topic, which in this case, it was mathematical patterning again. So students of the classroom would enter the gaming space, they would decide to go to an area and they would play, then they would be bored and they would switch to another area. So while we were actually play testing this concept, we realized that we had an issue. And the issue was that players would actually play 1 or 2 games and then they would already have a mastery of the topic. So when they would try to play another game, they would feel bored because there was no challenge. So what we decided to do, we came up with we drafted different user journeys for each game, taking into account that they would be played by players with different experience, different level of experience. And based on this, we tried to come up with an overall progression strategy, taking into account that this gaming space is going to be played in a non-linear way by different types of students. And in this way, we integrated, every time that the players would actually enter a game, they would enter the profile, and in this way, the game would adapt the leveling progression to the needs of, to the style and the profile of the students that we had. So, educational game designers need to take into account several aspects when they design, and several factors when they design their games. The more educational game design matures, the more it becomes obvious that we have a need for holistic and global need for user experience strategies that will ensure a generic, homogeneous gaming learning experience. A very important aspect that we need to take into account is that we need to maintain balance between gaming and learning aspects, and personas and user journeys are a very interesting tool that can help us achieve this. However, it is very important that we take into account that we need to adapt them to the needs of each individual educational game that we want to design. Thank you very much. Okay. So, okay, we have time.
I guess I'll just stand here. Thanks for the talk. This is something of really a high interest to me. When I was in university, I dealt with this type of thing a lot, and one of the things we rubbed up against, as you mentioned briefly, was a lot of the educators and the content experts had a misconception that because it is a game, it will be fun. And because it's fun, students will engage in the content. And because students are engaging in the learning content, let's just throw as much learning content in, usually in like walls of text and stuff. And it was to the antithesis of what they're trying to accomplish. So I guess my question is, how have you been successful addressing those misconceptions directly with those educators? I know from a designer, you talk about keeping a balance with yourself, but there's often a misconception happening on the other end. How do you achieve that balance with those people?
Okay. Thank you very much. Basically, this is a general and very big challenge for educational game design. I feel that evolution and revolution does not come in one day, and usually it needs time, and we need time to change our way of seeing things and our perspectives. I feel that both educators and game designers want to hear the other. They want to create games that are both learning, have a learning value, and are also fun. And it needs to take, you need time, you need to present all the time continuously your opinion. And I find that the more a consistent and a continuous design process is in place, the more easy it becomes for someone to gradually change their opinion and perspective on the topic. I don't say that it will happen immediately. I don't think this is the case, but I think that this is a challenge in general in design. However, I feel that it is us that actually will make the change if we need to. I don't know if I answered your questions. Okay. Thank you very much.